The jeers erupted like a thunderstorm, sudden and merciless, as Emily Thorne's carefully constructed presentation board tilted and then crashed to the classroom floor. The colourful charts and meticulously written note cards scattered across the linoleum like autumn leaves, her 3 weeks of research on Renaissance art reduced to chaos in an instant. A single blue marker rolled toward the door, leaving a thin azure streak in its wake. "Typical Thorne disaster," someone whispered, loud enough to reach her burning ears. The classroom's fluorescent lights seemed to intensify, casting harsh shadows that exposed her every imperfection. The coffee stain on her white uniform blouse, the loose thread dangling from her plaid skirt, the scuff marks on her once polished shoes. Miss Hargrove sighed from behind her desk, the sound like sandpaper against Emily's already raw nerves. "Just clean it up quickly, Emily. We need to move on to Sophia's presentation." The teacher's voice carried that familiar note of resignation that Emily had grown accustomed to hearing whenever her name was mentioned. The soft ticking of the classroom clock punctuated the silence as Emily knelt to gather her fallen work. Tick, tick, tick. Each second marked another moment of humiliation. Her classmates watched with expressions ranging from amusement to indifference, not a single one moving to help. She caught the reflection of herself in the classroom window, 17 years old, shoulders hunched, dark hair falling forward to shield her face, a portrait of defeat. "Should have known better than to let the scholarship case handle the history competition prelims," muttered Blake Weston, the student council president with perfect teeth and a father who donated the school's new science wing. "Some people just don't belong at St. Catherine's." Emily's fingers trembled as she collected her notes, the paper edges cutting tiny, invisible wounds into her fingertips. She wouldn't cry. Not here. Not now. The ticking clock continued its relentless rhythm, marking the seconds of her disgrace. Tick, tick, tick. Later, after the final bell had rung and the hallways had emptied of chattering students, Emily lingered in the chapel. She hadn't planned to go there. Her faith had grown as threadbare as the soles of her second-hand shoes, but something had pulled her toward the quiet sanctuary. Afternoon sunlight filtered through stained glass, casting pools of ruby and sapphire across the worn wooden pews. The empty chapel smelled of beeswax candles and aged hymnals, a scent that transported her back to Sunday mornings with her grandmother before the cancer took her. Emily sat in the last pew, her school bag heavy beside her. From its depths, she withdrew a small leather-bound journal, her grandmother's parting gift, pages filled with scripture and personal reflections. Emily hadn't opened it in months. The binding creaked slightly as she ran her thumb along its edge, still not quite ready to read the words inside. "It's a beautiful space to think, isn't it?" The voice startled her. Emily looked up to find Mrs. Lambert, the elderly literature teacher, standing in the aisle. Unlike most of the faculty at St. Catherine's Preparatory Academy, Mrs. Lambert didn't come from wealth or privilege. Her clothes were simple but dignified, her silver hair pulled back in a practical bun. Rumor had it she'd turned down positions at prestigious universities to continue teaching high school students. "I didn't mean to disturb you," Mrs. Lambert said, her voice gentle. "I often come here when the day has been challenging." Emily slipped the journal back into her bag. "I was just leaving. That was quite a difficult moment in class today." Mrs. Lambert sat down beside her, the wooden pew creaking slightly under their combined weight. "But you know, I once dropped an entire tray of beakers in chemistry class. The sound was so spectacular that students from other classrooms came running to see what had happened." Despite herself, Emily felt the corner of her mouth twitch upward. "What did you do?" "I took a bow." Mrs. Lambert's eyes crinkled at the corners. "Sometimes, dear, all we can do is acknowledge our humanity and continue forward." The clock in the chapel tower chimed 4 times, its deep resonance vibrating through the empty space. Tick, tick, tick. Emily could still hear the phantom ticking, marking moments, opportunities, failures. I noticed your research on Botticelli, Mrs. Lambert said, changing the subject. Your analysis of his use of light was quite insightful. Emily blinked in surprise. You saw my notes. Before they became confetti, yes. Mrs. Lambert smiled. The regional academic decathlon is looking for a student to represent St. Catherine's in the art history category. Their previous candidate withdrew due to scheduling conflicts. Why are you telling me this? Because I'd like to submit your name for consideration. Emily laughed, the sound sharp and disbelieving in the quiet chapel. You're joking, after what happened today. Besides, Blake Weston is handling all the history competitions. Everyone knows that. Blake is focusing on political history. Art history remains open. Mrs. Lambert's gaze was steady. The decision is yours, of course. Think about it. As Mrs. Lambert stood to leave, a beam of coloured light from the stained glass window fell across the pew where Emily sat, illuminating her grandmother's journal. For a moment, just a moment, the leather seemed to glow with an inner light. Emily's fingers brushed against its worn cover. Mrs. Lambert, Emily called as the teacher reached the chapel door. What if I'm not good enough? The older woman turned back, her silhouette framed by the doorway. That, my dear, is the question we all ask ourselves. The answer rarely comes from within. 2 days later, Emily found herself standing outside the faculty meeting room, her heart hammering against her ribs. She'd spent hours reorganizing her Renaissance art research, expanding her analysis, practicing her delivery until her throat was raw. The hallway was deserted, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the polished floor. From behind the closed door came the murmur of voices, the academic committee deciding who would represent St. Catherine's in each category of the regional academic decathlon. The door swung open suddenly, and Emily stepped back, nearly colliding with a display case of gleaming sports trophies. Headmaster Phillips emerged, followed by Ms. Hargrove and several other teachers. His eyes landed on Emily, mild surprise registering on his face. Miss Thorne, can I help you? Emily's mouth went dry. The clock on the wall behind him ticked loudly in the silence. Tick, tick, tick. I wanted to submit my research for consideration. For the art history category. Ms. Hargrove raised an eyebrow. After your performance in class, I hardly think... I'll take that, Mrs. Lambert interrupted, appearing behind the headmaster. She extended her hand for Emily's folder. We were just discussing that category. Headmaster Phillips checked his watch. We've nearly concluded our meeting, Miss Thorne. Your timing is unfortunate. Just give her 5 minutes, Mrs. Lambert said firmly. That's all I ask. To Emily's surprise, the headmaster hesitated, then nodded. 5 minutes. No more. The faculty meeting room was intimidating, oak-panelled walls lined with portraits of previous headmasters, a massive table dominating the centre. Emily stood at one end, acutely aware of her second-hand uniform and scuffed shoes. 7 faculty members watched her, with expressions ranging from impatience to curiosity. She began speaking, her voice initially unsteady, then growing stronger as she delved into Botticelli's use of light and religious symbolism. She explained how his work bridged medieval religious art and Renaissance humanism, her hands moving expressively as she described the delicate balance between the sacred and the secular in his compositions. The light in Botticelli's paintings doesn't just illuminate, it transforms, Emily said, warming to her subject. It doesn't erase the shadows, it gives them meaning. When she finished, there was a moment of silence broken only by the ticking of the wall clock. Tick, tick, tick. Thank you, Miss Thorne, Headmaster Phillips said, his expression unreadable. We'll inform all candidates of our decisions tomorrow. That night, Emily couldn't sleep. Her tiny bedroom in the apartment she shared with her mother, a nurse who worked night shifts at the county hospital, felt suffocating. Rain pattered against the window, creating rivulets that distorted the streetlights outside. The digital clock on her nightstand glowed 2:17 a.m., its silent counting somehow louder than the audible ticking of the school clocks. She retrieved her grandmother's journal from her school bag, finally opening its pages. Her grandmother's handwriting was delicate but clear, the words flowing across the paper like a gentle current. Emily's fingers traced the familiar script, landing on an underlined passage. "For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them." Something stirred in Emily's chest. Not quite hope, but perhaps its distant cousin. She fell asleep with the journal open beside her, the rain's rhythm finally drowning out the phantom ticking in her mind. Morning arrived grey and subdued. Emily walked to school under an umbrella, puddles reflecting the clouded sky. The school hallways buzzed with anticipation as students gathered around the main bulletin board where the academic decathlon team selections would be posted. "They'd be idiots not to choose me for political history," Blake was saying to his circle of friends as Emily approached. "My father practically wrote the check for the entire competition." Emily hung back, watching as a staff member pushed through the crowd to pin the list to the board. Students surged forward, exclamations of triumph and disappointment filling the air. Emily waited until the initial rush subsided before approaching the board. Her eyes scanned the list once, twice, certain she had missed her name. But there it was, under Art History, Emily Thorne. "This has to be a mistake," came Blake's voice from behind her. He stood with his usual entourage, his expression a mixture of disbelief and disdain. "Thorne? Seriously?" "Maybe they felt sorry for her," suggested Sophia Matthews, tossing her perfectly styled hair. "Charity case becomes charity choice." The words stung, but Emily kept her expression neutral as she turned away from the board. The hallway seemed longer than usual as she walked toward her first class, whispers following in her wake like persistent shadows. When she entered the classroom, the conversations abruptly ceased. 24 pairs of eyes turned toward her, none of them friendly. Her usual seat had been taken, someone's bag placed conspicuously on the chair. Emily stood frozen for a moment, then moved to the only empty desk, isolated in the far corner. As she sat down, someone hissed, "Scholarship student steals spotlight. How original." The ticking of the classroom clock filled the awkward silence. Tick, tick, tick. Each second, an eternity of exclusion. The following weeks brought preparation for the regional academic decathlon. Emily met with Mrs. Lambert after school, refining her presentation, deepening her analysis. The topic had been officially announced: Divine Light in Renaissance Art, Sacred Illumination in a Secular Age. It fit her research perfectly, almost suspiciously so. "Did you request this topic?" Emily asked Mrs. Lambert during one of their sessions. The teacher smiled enigmatically. "The committee decides the topics. I merely noted where student interests lay." Meanwhile, Emily's isolation at school intensified. Her textbooks disappeared from her desk during lunch breaks. Her locker was decorated with crude drawings. In group assignments, no one chose her, forcing teachers to assign her to reluctant teams. The ticking of classroom clocks became her constant companion, marking hours of loneliness. Tick, tick, tick. One afternoon, returning to her locker after classes, Emily found Blake and his friends waiting for her. "We need to talk, Thorne," Blake said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "About the decathlon." Emily clutched her books tighter. "What about it? You don't actually think you have a chance of winning, do you?" His voice was casual, conversational almost. "St. Catherine's has a reputation to maintain. We can't have someone like you representing us." "Someone like me," Emily repeated, a dangerous edge to her voice. "You know what I mean." Blake leaned against the lockers. "Look, it's simple. You withdraw, cite personal reasons, whatever. I'll take over the art history category. I can handle both. Everyone wins." Except me. Blake's friendly facade slipped slightly. Be realistic, Thorne. You don't belong here. Never have. This little academic adventure of yours is just prolonging the inevitable. The hallway was empty, except for Blake's friends, who watched the exchange with amused interest. The school felt cavernous suddenly, echoing with unspoken threats. In the distance, a clock chimed. Tick, tick, tick. I'm not withdrawing, Emily said, surprised by the steadiness of her voice. Blake's expression hardened. Then you'll fail, publicly and humiliatingly, I guarantee it. That evening, Emily sat on the fire escape outside her apartment window, her grandmother's journal open in her lap. The city sprawled below, lights flickering on as dusk descended. She had read most of the journal now, finding comfort in her grandmother's reflections on faith during difficult times. One entry stood out. Adversity introduces us to ourselves. It strips away pretense and reveals what truly lies beneath. Sometimes God allows us to be emptied so that we might be filled with something better. Emily's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Withdraw now or regret it tomorrow. The ticking in her mind grew louder. Tick, 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 time running out, pressure building. She didn't sleep that night. The next day, Emily arrived at school to find printouts plastered across the main hallway, her middle school records, showing her academic probation after her grandmother's death when her grades had plummeted. Next to these were screenshots of social media posts from her former school, comments about the weird orphan girl who talked to herself. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to dig up her past. Students pointed and whispered as she walked through the hallway, her face burning with humiliation. In her first class, someone had written "fraud" across her desk in permanent marker. Quite the interesting reading material in the hallway, Miss Hargrove commented as Emily took her seat, making no move to address the vandalism on the desk. One wonders how such a student gained admission to St. Catherine's. The classroom clock ticked mercilessly. Tick, tick, tick. Each second an accusation. During lunch, Emily escaped to the chapel seeking solitude. To her surprise, she found Mrs. Lambert there, sitting quietly in meditation. "They found my old records," Emily said without preamble, her voice tight with unshed tears. "From when Grandma died, and I couldn't function. They're saying I don't deserve to be here." Mrs. Lambert didn't seem surprised. "And what do you say?" "Maybe they're right." The admission hurt, like pulling out a deeply embedded splinter. "Maybe I am a fraud. We all have seasons of struggle, Emily. What matters is not that you fell, but that you rose again." Mrs. Lambert reached into her bag and pulled out a small wooden box. "I've been waiting for the right moment to give you this." The box was simple but beautiful, polished oak, with a small cross inlaid in darker wood on the lid. Emily opened it carefully to find a silver pendant inside, a delicate rendering of Botticelli's Light Rays from The Annunciation. "It's a reminder," Mrs. Lambert said softly. "Light breaks most beautifully through the darkest places." Emily held the pendant, feeling its weight in her palm. "I don't know if I can face them tomorrow." "You don't have to face them alone." Mrs. Lambert's voice was gentle but firm. "You never did." The chapel clock began to chime, the sound reverberating through the empty space. Tick, tick, tick. But this time, the sound felt different. Not accusatory, but affirming, marking not what was lost, but what remained. That night, Emily placed her grandmother's journal and the silver pendant on her small desk. She worked until dawn, not on her decathlon presentation, but on something else entirely. Something unexpected. The regional academic decathlon arrived with unseasonable warmth, sunshine spilling across the campus of the host school. Students from 12 prestigious academies gathered in crisp uniforms, the air charged with competitive energy. St. Catherine's team clustered together, carefully excluding Emily, who stood apart, the silver pendant visible at her throat. Blake approached her just before the opening ceremonies. "Last chance, Thorne. Withdraw now. Save yourself the embarrassment." Emily met his gaze steadily. "No." "Your funeral," he smirked. "By the way, Several judges received anonymous emails about your academic probation. Just thought you should be prepared. The art history competition was scheduled for the afternoon. As Emily waited for her turn, she watched Blake deliver a flawless presentation on political revolutions, charming the judges with well-practiced confidence. Her hands trembled slightly as she reviewed her notes one last time. The pendant felt warm against her skin. When her name was called, Emily walked to the presentation area with measured steps. The judges watched her with neutral expressions. From the audience, she could see the St. Catherine's contingent, their faces ranging from indifference to open hostility. Mrs. Lambert sat in the back, her presence a silent affirmation. Emily took a deep breath. The room was silent, except for the soft ticking of a wall clock. Tick, tick, tick. My original presentation today was titled Divine Light in Renaissance Art, she began. I had planned to discuss Botticelli's techniques for representing spiritual illumination in a changing world. She paused, looking directly at her classmates. But instead, I'd like to present something different, something more personal. From her folder, Emily withdrew not her prepared slides, but a series of hand-drawn images, her own artwork, created over the sleepless night. Each piece depicted moments of light breaking through darkness, dawn over a city skyline, a candle in a storm, stars appearing after clouds parted. Light has been humanity's oldest metaphor for hope, for divine presence, for truth, she said, her voice gaining strength. Botticelli understood that light doesn't just reveal what is beautiful, it transforms what is broken. She held up her final drawing, a sketch of St. Catherine's Chapel, sunlight streaming through the stained glass, illuminating a solitary figure in a school uniform. Student rejected by entire class was chosen to represent school in finals, she said, giving voice to the title that had been whispered behind her back for weeks. That's what they've been saying about me, and they're right. I was rejected. I am the scholarship case. I did struggle academically after losing my grandmother. The audience shifted uncomfortably. Even the judges seemed caught off guard by this unusual turn. But here's what Botticelli would see, not a rejection story, but a light story. Emily's voice filled the room, steady and clear. Because light doesn't avoid darkness. It enters it, transforms it, claims it. She touched the pendant at her throat. Renaissance artists understood something we often forget, that what makes light holy isn't its perfection, but its persistence. It keeps showing up, keeps breaking through, keeps transforming what it touches. Emily looked directly at her classmates now. You can reject me, you can mock me, you can expose my worst moments and deepest failures, but you cannot stop the light. Not the light in art, not the light in truth, and not the light in me. When she finished, there was a moment of complete silence. Then, from the back of the room, Mrs. Lambert began to applaud. Slowly, others joined in, first the judges, then students from other schools, until the applause filled the room. Emily returned to her seat, legs shaking, adrenaline coursing through her veins. She didn't look at her classmates, didn't want to see their reactions. What she had done was either brilliantly brave or catastrophically foolish. Either way, it was done. Hours later, the judges announced the results. Emily sat alone, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. When they called her name as the winner of the art history category, she couldn't move for a moment, certain she had misheard. Emily Thorne, St. Catherine's Preparatory Academy, the head judge repeated. Please come forward to receive your medal. The walk to the podium felt surreal. As the medal was placed around her neck, Emily caught sight of Blake's thunderstruck expression. His perfect composure finally cracked. Beside him, several of her classmates looked away, unable to meet her gaze. Your presentation was unconventional, the head judge told her quietly as he shook her hand, but authentic. In a competition full of memorized analyses, you showed us what art actually does. It transforms. St. Catherine's won the overall competition by a narrow margin, Emily's first-place finish in art history providing the crucial points. As the team gathered for photographs, an awkward tension hung in the air. Emily stood at the edge of the group, her medal gleaming against her uniform. Headmaster Phillips approached her after the ceremony, his expression inscrutable. "That was quite a risk you took, Miss Thorne." "Yes, sir. Not the presentation we expected." "No, sir." He studied her for a long moment. "It was better." He extended his hand. "Congratulations. You've done St. Catherine's proud." The ride back to school was uncomfortable, the bus filled with subdued conversation. Emily sat alone near the front, watching raindrops race each other down the window, leaving crooked trails on the glass. Her medal was tucked safely in her bag, along with her grandmother's journal. As students disembarked at St. Catherine's, Sophia Matthews paused beside Emily's seat. For a moment, they looked at each other in silence. "I saw the records they posted," Sophia said finally. "About your grandmother. I lost my dad last year, cancer too." She hesitated. "It messes you up." Emily nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "Your presentation was... It wasn't what I expected." Sophia shifted uncomfortably. "It was good. Really good." She walked away before Emily could respond. Mrs. Lambert found Emily in the chapel that evening, sitting in the same pew where their conversation had begun weeks ago. The medal lay beside her on the worn wood. "You didn't use your prepared presentation," Mrs. Lambert observed, sitting down. "No," Emily smiled faintly. "I hope you're not disappointed." "Quite the contrary." Mrs. Lambert's eyes crinkled. "You found your voice. That's worth more than any competition." The chapel clock chimed softly, the sound peaceful in the quiet space. Tick, 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 marking not condemnation now, but possibility. 2 days later, Emily arrived at school to find a different atmosphere. Students didn't exactly welcome her. There were no sudden friendships or dramatic apologies, but the active hostility had dissipated. In calculus, someone returned her missing textbook, anonymously left on her desk. In English, a group actually requested her to join them for a project. Blake still glared from across the cafeteria, his pride wounded, his influence diminished. But others had begun to recognize that perhaps their judgment had been hasty, their cruelty unwarranted. The following Monday, Headmaster Phillips made an announcement during morning assembly. Due to her outstanding performance at the Regional Academic Decathlon, Emily Thorne has been selected to represent St. Catherine's at the national finals in Chicago next month. A smattering of applause broke out, not enthusiastic but genuine. As Emily walked across the auditorium to accept the official invitation, she felt dozens of eyes following her. The spotlight seemed to find her, illuminating her path. For the first time in months, she stood straight, shoulders back, head high. That afternoon, as spring rain tapped gentle rhythms against classroom windows, Emily opened her grandmother's journal to write her own entry. The classroom was empty except for her, the only sound the familiar ticking of the wall clock. Tick, tick, tick. "Today I understood something about light," she wrote. "It doesn't need permission to shine. It just does, breaking through whatever stands in its way, not with force but with persistence. Maybe faith works the same way. It doesn't demand space, it finds it, creates it, transforms it, one small ray at a time." The rain continued to fall, washing away the last vestiges of winter. In the chapel across the courtyard, stained glass transformed ordinary sunlight into something sacred. And in a classroom that had once felt like a battlefield, a young woman closed a journal, picked up her medal, and stepped into a future suddenly bright with possibility. 3 weeks later, at the national finals, Emily stood before judges and competitors from across the country. Her presentation, refined but still deeply personal, earned her second place and a scholarship offer from an art history professor in the audience. But it was what happened after the awards ceremony that mattered most. As students gathered for the closing reception, a girl from a competing school approached Emily. "Is it true?" she asked hesitantly. What they're saying about you, that your entire class rejected you and you still represented them. Emily considered the question, fingering the silver pendant that hadn't left her neck since Mrs. Lambert had given it to her. That's part of the story, she said finally. But not the whole story. What's the whole story? Emily smiled, thinking of the journey from humiliation to this moment, of classroom clocks and chapel light, of persistence and transformation, of small kindnesses and gradual changes, of a faith once threadbare now quietly strengthening. The whole story, she said, is still being written. In her grandmother's journal, carried in her bag even here, hundreds of miles from home, a passage was underlined in fading ink. But we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us. We are hard-pressed on every side, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed. The pendant caught the light, scattering tiny reflections across the room like stars. Tick, 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 time moving forward, light breaking through, story continuing.